The medic's hands worked at the drainage site below his left ribs with a steady, purposeful pressure that was not quite pain and not quite nothing. Harwick lay still for it. He had learned to lie still, genuinely still. Not the performed stillness of a man suppressing response, but the actual stillness of a man who had processed these sensations into a neutral category a long time ago. He was a bag of laundry on a table. He had been a bag of laundry on many tables, in many fee facilities, on 12 worlds over 19 years, and the quality of the stillness he could produce had changed across that time from something effortful, with held breath and micro-flinching, to something complete and unthinking. His body had been worked on enough times that the experience of being worked on had become the baseline, rather than the exception. The ceiling above him was pale and water-stained and close. Medici ceilings were always close. He breathed through his nose. The smell of the place was the specific smell that all these places had, which was organic rot successfully suppressed to a background level that the suppressants never fully eliminated. Old wound matter absorbed into the walls through years of proximity. Biological residue embedded in the fabric of the curtain partitions, in the grain of the wooden boards under the cots, in the fibrous material of the mattresses themselves, the particular sweetness of gangrene that had been treated and healed, and left its presence in the building. Not the smell of active infection, but the residual trace of what infection had been. The ghost of something serious that the building had absorbed and neutralized and held. He had learned to smell this smell and register it as neutral, the way a man who worked in a rendering facility learned to process what was always in the air, and what would always be in the air regardless of what he felt about it. It meant he was still alive. It meant his body had done the same stubborn, stupid thing it always did, which was to refuse to stop, which was a quality he had long since stopped interpreting as a virtue. This was, by his count, the 14th Medici facility he had been admitted to as a patient, not counting forward treatment positions, not counting fighting position first aid, not counting the 3 instances where a surgeon had worked on him in a transport vehicle. During movement between positions, those were a different category. Formal admissions, designated beds, a curtain for privacy, even if nobody behind the curtain had privacy in any meaningful functional sense, because the ward sounds traveled through every curtain, and you learned more about your neighbor's conditions from sound than you would have chosen to know. 14 facilities, 12 worlds, a span of time that had the shape of a career without ever having the feel of one, because careers had progression built into them somewhere, and this had not progressed so much as continued. The same fundamental situation, repeating in different geographies with different supporting cast members. The wound events arriving and being processed and producing recovery periods that ended in return to duty, which produced further wound events, which produced further process. He had long since stopped finding the facilities strange or frightening, or even particularly notable. The Medici environment had become as ordinary to him as any operational environment, with some sounds, its own light quality, its own rhythms of staff movement and procedure, its own periods of activity and quiet. He knew how long discharge would take from the feel of a wound's closure. He knew which sounds in the night meant a routine procedure, and which meant a crisis. He knew the way a facility's smell shifted towards something worse when the wards were overloaded, which was a smell distinct from the base smell, layered on top of it, and he knew how long after that smell appeared, before conditions improved or did not improve. Almost closed, the medic said. She said it to herself, a note of professional confirmation, not to Harwick. The drainage tube came out with a pulling sensation that traveled inward rather than outward, a deep internal drag behind his sternum, a pull from somewhere in the chest's interior architecture that had no obvious connection to a wound below his arm. His left lung had been producing this sensation since wound 15, since the surgical repair had closed the damage and rearranged something in the surrounding structure that had never been rearranged back. The repair had been successful by every measurable standard. He could march, carry, dig and fire without incapacity. The lung participated in breathing at a slightly reduced functional rate on that side, which Surgeon Major Trent had certified as within operational parameters, and he experienced this reduced function primarily as the pulling sensation when drainage tubes were removed, and as a slightly longer recovery time for sustained exertion at altitude. This was acceptable. He had been in worse situations with worse equipment. The medic applied the closure foam. The foam had a smell that was a subset of the general medici smell, more chemical, slightly sweet, and when it cured or when it was near his face, which was impossible from this wound location but happened anyway, the chemical compounds moving through the air in ways that bypassed geography. It produced a specific flat metallic taste at the back of his throat. Not blood, nothing like blood. The taste of old hardware fittings, of metal that had been wet and dried many times without cleaning, a dry mineral rust that lived in the industrial parts of the world and nowhere else. He swallowed. The medic did not notice. There was a man in the chair beside the cot. He had been there when Harwick woke that morning, which was not standard. Medici intake scribes arrived after procedures, not before and not during. This man had a writing board, a form on it, and a pen that he was holding but not yet using. These one the medics work with the careful, detached attention of a person recording the circumstances of something, rather than participating in it. Corporal Harwick, the man said when the medic stepped back. Yes, my name is Carpenter. I'm here to complete your processing document. Harwick looked at the ceiling. All right, this will take some time. I'll need to go through your entire service record, all 23 incidents. Right, Harwick said again. He had been saying all right for 19 years. To people who announced things that required a response. It was the correct response to most things. It communicated comprehension without either enthusiasm or resistance, which was usually the correct register. The medic finished. The curtain rings slid and she was gone. Carpenter had the manner of a man whose career had been conducted in buildings that did not move, and did not catch fire, and did not require the immediate departure of everyone inside. Soft hands, precise posture, the specific patience of someone who believed forms would always be completed because in his experience they always had been. Harwick had no problem with this. He had met many men like this, had been processed through facilities, staffed by men like this many times, and he understood their function as clearly as he understood his own. They were the architecture that made the operations possible. Without them, nothing was authorized. Without authorization, nothing happened, which was in certain situations worse than the things that happened with authorization. He looked at the header on Carpenter's form, while Carpenter organized his materials. A standard Munitorum layout, columns, fields, reference sections, but the header itself was not Form Medici 119B, which was what Trent had always used for fitness certification. The form Harwick had watched Trent complete 16 times from wound 15 onward. Different header. He made a note of it, filed it, said nothing. There was always time to ask. Wound Incident 1, Carpenter said, and uncapped his pen. Harwick described Wound Incident 1. It took less time than it should have, because there was very little in it. He had been 17. There had been a levy on Dry Marsh Primus, which was a swamp hive in the outer reaches of the helical subsector, and which he had left thinking he would return to at some point, and had not returned to, and which he now thought of rarely and without particular feeling except for specific sensory details that ambushed him occasionally, which he did not discuss in the context of wound documentation. He had been processed through Holding Camp 19, a long corridor that smelled of industrial cleaning compound, numbered queues, forms handed through a window, forms handed back, a designation assigned to replace a name. He had been given a las rifle that was not new, kit that had been issued to someone before him, and returned in a condition that suggested the previous user had not maintained it with particular care, and a berth in a transit hold with 300 other levied men and women, most of whose names he had not learned before they shipped out, and would not learn at all. Wound Incident 1. A las bolt to the left thigh on his first deployment. on a world the unit called Mudhole, somewhere in the Threlian reaches. Partial thickness burn. 4 days in the Medici Bay, thinking about whether the mold in the corner of his bunk berth would still be there when he returned, and whether the last rifle he'd be issued on return would be the same one. It had not been the same one. The mold had migrated slightly to the right. Wound Incident 2, Carpenter said. The ward beyond the curtain partitions was quiet for this hour. Somewhere to Harwick's left, a patient was breathing with too much liquid in it. He recognized the sound. He had heard it come out of himself once, after wound 15, in the 3 days following the surgery, before the drainage had managed the situation. He did not think about what it meant for the patient across the curtain. He had learned not to make that calculation in advance. Right forearm, Harwick said. He paused. I believe the right forearm. Shrapnel from an artillery piece that came down 3 houses from our position. Small fragment removed in the field. Bandaged for 12 days. Right forearm, Carpenter repeated, writing. Harwick looked at both forearms. His right arm had the burn scar from wound 6 running from mid-forearm to the back of the wrist, which he knew precisely. Left arm had a raised area near the wrist that he had always attributed to something, but could not now specify. He could not reconstruct wound 2's location from his body's current evidence with any certainty. Too many subsequent events had created too many subsequent marks, and the marks did not hold their narratives neatly. They accumulated, they overlapped, they settled into a general topology that told him something had happened many times, but did not always tell him what. Or the left, he said. I believe the right. The field record will confirm it. Carpenter noted the uncertainty and moved on. The ventilation housing above the door had a fan in it. The fan's blades had a slight asymmetry, a mechanical imperfection in one blade that produced a brief additional resistance on one specific beat of the rotation cycle. Smooth, smooth, smooth catch. He had been in this bay for 9 days, and had been hearing this fan at night when the ward was quiet enough. But he heard it now, in the middle of the morning, and he was not in the bay. He was in Hab Block 7, Level 14, Dry Marsh Primus, in the alcove where the water recycler was mounted to the bulkhead with 2 bolts, because the other 2 bolt holes had stripped threads, and his mother had not had the correct driver to cut new ones and could not afford to have someone else do it. The coupling fitting on the recycler rattled. It had always rattled. On the 3rd rotation it was smooth, and on the 4th it caught, and the sound traveled through the metal wall into the adjacent room, and from the room into wherever he was lying, and he had lain there for all the years before anything else, listening to this rhythm as the thing that preceded sleep. Smooth and rattle and smooth, and sometimes very early in the morning when the condensation in the coupling dried, as the hab warmed up the rattle changed pitch, went higher, and that was morning. It was specifically morning, not light through a viewport, not voices in the corridor, but the recycler going slightly higher and the knowledge that the day was beginning. Wound Incident 3, Carpenter said. He was in the cot. The fan was a fan, he said. A crush injury to the right hand. A supply crate fell from a half-loaded chimera during a transit movement and caught my hand between its lower edge and the ground. 2 knuckles, 1 confirmed fracture. 6 weeks in a splint. I remained on duty in a non-firing classification. He did not say anything about Dry Marsh Primus. He moved on. 6 weeks with a splintered hand meant mixed weeks, watching engagements from the side, carrying things with his left hand, standing in positions where his non-firing status required him to be present, but not to fire, which was the kind of absence that was worse than action in specific ways he had not anticipated at the time. He had watched enough of those engagements to understand the shape of them before they resolved. He had watched people he knew and people he didn't know go into position and come back, or not come back, and the going in was always specific, and the not coming back was oft abrupt, and the particular quality of watching without the option to participate had a kind of damage in it that didn't appear anywhere in the wound record. Wounds 4 and 5 he described sequentially. Wound 4, lower back, 6 shrapnel fragments, 3 removed by a field surgeon whose name would be in the record but not in Howick's memory. 3 fragments left in place against spinal architecture, where removal presented more danger than retention. Those 3 pieces of metal were still in there. He felt them as a constant internal pressure on the left side of his lower back. Not pain, just occupancy, the sensation of foreign architecture embedded in the surrounding tissue, making itself known when he bent forward, when he slept on his left side, when temperatures dropped and the tissue contracted slightly around the things inside it. Wound 5. A promethium splash burn to the back of his neck and upper shoulders. Secondary effect of a vehicle destroyed at closer range than recommended. 9 days recovery, unremarkable. The hand, wound 7, not 3, was different from the others in a way he described more carefully, not emotionally, just with more precision, because the event required more precision. He had been on his 7th deployment, on an industrial world that had lost most of its atmospheric management through orbital bombardment. The cold there was not weather. It was infrastructure failure, the specific cold of a building whose heating had been deliberately and systematically destroyed. Cold that came from the absence of something that had previously been present, rather than from the presence of actual cold. He had been crossing a transit yard at approximately 0400 ZRU, a resupply movement between 2 holding positions, when the Chimera ahead of him in the column had lost traction. The ground was a compound of mud and construction aggregate that had the worst properties of both and the stabilizing properties of neither, and the Chimera's rear left track had broken traction and the vehicle had swung sideways, with the particular inevitability of large machines in motion, doing what they were going to do, regardless of what people near them would prefer. He had moved. He had not moved enough. He understood this in retrospect with complete clarity. The geometry did not support the outcome he had been attempting. Distance between his hand and the swing radius of the skirt plate was insufficient for the time available, and the calculation his body had performed and acted on had been correct and had still been wrong. The skirt plate caught his left hand between its lower edge and the aggregate surface. The wrong vocabulary for this was pressure, because pressure implied weight moving in one direction with one quality, but the skirt plate was in lateral motion simultaneously with its downward movement, and so the forces at the point of contact were compound, a downward crushing component and a lateral shearing component meeting at the architecture of his hand simultaneously. The bones of his hand attempted to root the force. They spread it, distributed it through the structure the way a building's foundation attempts to redirect extraordinary load laterally before the primary columns give, and for perhaps 0.3 of a second this worked, and then the load exceeded the structural capacity, and the root became the collapse. What he felt from the inside was not impact, but a wave, a compression wave moving through his hand from the contact point inward, the metacarpal bones squeezing against each other with nowhere for the pressure to go, the soft tissue between and around them swelling in the instant of maximum compression. Skin held longer than the structures beneath it. Then the swelling overcame the skin's tolerance, and the skin began, under enormous and obvious protest, to accommodate the interior reality. He felt this process from inside as a sequence of distinct events that his brain could not process at the rate they occurred. Occupying, compressing, swelling, failing. He was conscious for all of it. His stomach made the correct assessment and followed through on it 45 seconds later. The surgery was 3 procedures. Recovery was 4 months. The result was a hand that worked in the ways that mattered. It closed a fist, it gripped a las rifle. The fingers pointed correctly and bent when asked to bend. The rebuilt metacarpal architecture under the 4/5 fingers produced a different topography on the back of the hand than it had before. Slightly higher, slightly asymmetric, and the fine motor pressure from that side of the hand arrived, through rebuilt pathways, slightly slower than the right hand, requiring a small compensation he had incorporated, without effort within the first year. The hand was a hand. It was not the same hand. What changed with the hand was his relationship with equipment. He had spent 19 months prior to Wound 7 operating a standard issueless rifle, the way anyone operated a standard issueless rifle, which was automatically and without particular thought. After the hand, there was a period of approximately 3 months during which the left hand's grip produced wrong information, not weak information. Wrong information. The rebuilt nerves reporting grip pressure in a pattern that was close to correct, but offset in ways that required conscious correction. He had learned to monitor the grip rather than trust it, to verify by visual check what the nerve feedback was telling him, and this had produced a period of genuinely degraded performance that he had managed to keep out of his official record, because the engagements during recovery were in environments where the degradation did not manifest in ways that triggered command attention. Eventually, the monitoring became automatic. Eventually, the wrong information became the new correct baseline, and he calibrated to it. He stopped monitoring. The hand was a tool that worked. He did not think about it further. He still had the wound-packing gauze from the 3rd surgery. It had been in his uniform pocket when he was discharged, and he had retained it because gauze was useful and it was clean. It had persisted through 17 subsequent transfers and kit audits without anyone identifying it as anything other than a bandage, which was the only thing it needed to be. Carpenter wrote without comment. Wound 8 was a fragment to his left calf. He described it in 2 sentences, and then mentioned Sergeant Carver, who was not in his wound record, but was adjacent in his memory. Carver died during the same engagement. The resupply that arrived 2 days into the action brought ammunition for a Mark IV pattern auto-rifle. The unit had been reissued Mark V pattern auto-rifles 3 months earlier, during a general re-equip. The casing geometry difference between the 2 patterns was 4 mm. The Mark IV ammunition fit in the Mark V weapon. It did not chamber correctly under sustained fire. Carver's weapon jammed on his 3rd shot of a suppressive burst. He stood to clear the jam. He was shot by a position approximately 60 meters ahead. He died in the field, quickly, without what Harwick would characterize as any particular narrative significance to the cause. Wound 9. 2 toes from the left foot, 1 from the right. Lost to field gangrene following 6 weeks of standing in water that was not quite water. The specific biological consequence of standard issue boot waterproofing failing under conditions the Munitorum's testing had apparently not encompassed, or had encompassed and odd filed under an acceptable loss category. He had developed the infection in week 4, and had managed it himself for another 2 weeks before the smell became a problem. The unit's medic could not ignore. The amputations were clean. His gait was unchanged, or had adapted to appear unchanged. He packed the toe space in his boots with rags. He had waterproofed the replacement boots with a promethium compound prepared by the unit cook, which was not authorized but which worked, and had waterproofed every subsequent pair the same way. Wound 10. A ferrocrete strike to the skull not penetrating. 3 weeks of nausea, tinnitus in the right ear fading by month 4. He moved on. The supporting characters in these years he described when Carpenter asked about them, and otherwise Guardsman Maddox had been on Wound 8's deployment, and several subsequent ones. A thin man from somewhere in the Agri-Belt subsectors who had a habit of developing structural theories about every defensive position they occupied, which were usually partially correct and occasionally useful. He had died on Harwick's 12th deployment in circumstances that were not in Harwick's wound record, and that he did not dwell on. Corporal Vennick had been in the unit for wounds 11 through 13, and was still alive at last report, attached to a different regiment following a transfer Harwick hadn't been present for. Surgeon Major Trent had entered the picture at Wound 15, and had remained a consistent presence in the records, if not always in person, through Wound 22. The names moved through his service record the way most things moved through service records, which was that they arrived and were present, and then at some point were not present, and the record noted when they stopped being present, but not much about the quality of what they had been. Between Wound 13's recovery and Wound 14, the unit held a static line for approximately 6 weeks. Harwick described this period to Carpenter because it was in the chronology, and because the record required it. The waiting period had a body weight that was different from both action and rest. He had been quiet to remain present and available in a fixed position where nothing was currently happening, and nothing was currently expected to happen, which was a state the body was not designed to sustain. He was braced for a load that was not arriving. The architectural stress of this, the sustained readiness with nothing to apply itself to, began manifesting in the joints within the first week. Knees, hips, the lower back. Not injury, not structural failure, but the specific complaint of load-bearing elements asked to maintain tension without purpose. The equivalent of a building's foundations kept in maximum compression mode, with no weight above them to justify the configuration. The joints protested this. The protest was a grinding, mechanical quality of discomfort that occupied the background of every hour, and against which there was no action to take. The eyelids became their own indicator by the end of week 2. They accumulated a weight that was distinct from sleep deprivation, not the sharp-edged degradation of being kept awake, but a slower, more philosophical heaviness. The body withdrawing investment from systems it had determined were not currently essential, and redirecting that investment to systems that might be needed quickly. He had learned to sleep in positions that were technically defensible as watchfulness from certain angles, a specific angle of the head, a specific posture with the spine against the parapet and the knees drawn up. Not comfortable, functional. He had learned this somewhere around round 11, and had never unlearned it. The sound of a static position was not silence, and he said this specifically to Carpenter, because inaccuracy bothered him. It was approximately 43 people breathing in proximity. The specific sound of fabric on fabric, that was the continuous low frequency of clothed human beings adjusting and settling. Sound of an unshaven hand passing over an unshaved face. A structural crack in the parapet above them had been dripping when they arrived and was dripping when they left and would presumably drip after them indefinitely, indifferent to presence or absence, at a rate of approximately 1 drip per 4 seconds that he had calculated involuntarily at some point in week 3 and then spent subsequent time understanding why he had done this. He had concluded his mind had run out of more productive functions and had performed the calculation automatically. The way a machine continued operating after the operator had stopped attending to output. Guardsman Maddox had, by this point in Harwick's service, developed his parapet theory. Maddox had a theory about the structural integrity of every defensive position they occupied, and this was the 7th such theory. He had explained it to Harwick 5 times in the first 3 weeks, each iteration slightly longer than the last. Harwick had memorized it involuntarily. The theory was wrong about 2 of the 4 sections identified as load-bearing. Harwick had identified this by the 3rd iteration, but correct about the central pillar, which was the important one, and which Maddox had correctly diagnosed as the main weight distributor for the upper section. Harwick had not corrected the error about the other 2 sections. Maddox's theory seemed to be doing something structural for Maddox's state of mind, and the parapet's correct analysis was less important than Maddox staying functional in a situation that was making everyone's state of mind worse. The degradation of proximity was a thing he described carefully, because he wanted the record to be accurate, and because he had observed it closely enough to have opinions about its specific mechanism. 43 people in a static defensive position developed micro-conflicts within the first 10 days. Conflicts that had nothing to do with the individuals involved, and everything to do with the absence of space and purpose. He had watched 2 guardsmen who had served together without significant friction for 3 years come close to a physical altercation over the question of where one of them placed a kit bag during a shared watch period. The kit bag was not in anyone's way. It was in the space between their 2 positions. The conflict was not about the kit bag. The conflict was about the specific quality of patience required to remain in a fixed position with the same people indefinitely, which was a patience that was not infinite for any of the 43, which depleted at different rates depending on the individual, and which produced, as it depleted, a heightened responsiveness to things that would not have registered as anything at all under normal conditions. He had his own threshold. He had located it approximately on day 31, when he had found himself genuinely irritated, in a way that required conscious management, by the specific timbre of one guardsman's cough. He had managed it, but it had required management. He had eaten standard rations type IV, with a frequency during those 6 weeks that had dissolved the distinction between hunger and the particular anticipatory resignation that preceded standard rations type IV. He had performed weapon maintenance twice daily, and then performed it again, because it was something to do that had completion and purpose. He had spent considerable time looking at approximately the same section of the sky above the trench parapet, and had noted weather changes and atmospheric shifts, and had assigned these no significance, because there was no significance to assign. Wound 13 occurred in week 3. A soft tissue fragment wound to the outer left thigh, treated in the fighting position with a kit, no facility transfer. The closure was imprecise and had healed with a raised ridge. He managed it with adhesive dressing as a mechanical buffer. Wound 14 ended the static period, not because the tactical situation changed, but because Sergeant-at-Arms Teller took a lasbolt from a position the intelligence summary had categorized as unoccupied. Teller was 2 feet from Harwick when it happened. They were in the middle of a sentence. Teller had been talking. Harwick's attention went to Teller's left boot. Teller was face down on the trench floor, and his left boot had come unlaced between the 4th and 5th eyelets. The loose lace end lay against the mud at a specific angle. The lace at the 4th eyelet was frayed, old fraying, the multi-generational kind. The fibers separated and partially rebonded over months of repeated threading, the end of the lace gone soft and multi-strand. This was a standard issue item available through Form Resupply Standard 14 upon written request. Processing time 3 to 11 days, depending on supply echelon load. He wondered whether Teller had ever submitted the form, and did not finish wondering because the firefight that followed required his attention. Wound 14 was a fragment to his left upper arm, soft tissue only, not noticed until after the firefight. Wound 15 was the one that changed the structural organization of everything after it. He told Carpenter about Wound 15 more slowly than the others, not dramatically, just more slowly, with more precision, because more precision was required. The setting was a boarding action inside a building complex, a breach and clear operation, a stack penetrating a defended corridor. He was third in the stack. Combatant, who produced Wound 15, had been moving along the wall in a manner inconsistent with standard human movement, a flexibility and speed that the part of him responsible for threat assessment had classified too slowly, and by the time the classification reached the response it was too late, and the blade was inside the arc of his arm before he had completed moving away from it. The blade entered below his left armpit at a downward hooking angle. From the inside, the event arrived in wrong order. The entry wound's nerve ending shut down within seconds, the body's triage prioritizing internal emergency over surface reporting, and so the information he received from outside his body was minimal. What he received from inside was a pressure event, the pleural space on his left side, registering a change in the chest cavity's interior architecture, a compression wave preceding the physical damage as the force moved through the soft tissue. His left lung received information about the approach before the damage arrived. Then the damage arrived, and the information changed character. From compression to opening, from pressure to collapse, the wall giving way inward, and the space behind it doing something wrong with the differential between interior and exterior pressure. For approximately 90 seconds his body believed both lungs were involved. The right side was sending secondary signals from the shock response. Wrong signals, signals that did not correspond to actual damage, and he operated under the assumption from his own nervous system that neither lung was functional, which produced a cognitive shift that was not panic. He recognized panic from prior experience. It had a specific quality of inefficiency, a particular flavor of spinning. This was different. This was the body's emergency operational mode, engaging beneath conscious direction, reallocating resources, overriding non-essential functions, running a catastrophic failure protocol that was faster and less precise than normal cognition, and that he could observe from somewhere inside it without being able to alter it, watching his own emergency response, the way a passenger watches a driver take an unexpected route. Surgeon Major Trent closed the lung in the field. Howick's memory of the surgery existed in segments, separated by complete absences, the stim-dose interaction with ongoing blood pressure, instability producing a gapped experience, clear stretches alternating with the nothing not registering, until he tried to reconstruct the sequence. The slice and found the pieces did not connect. He had tried twice to build the correct order of events from the fragments he had, and had produced two different sequences, each of which had internal logic, and neither of which he was confident was accurate. He returned to duty 61 days after Wound 15. Trent had filed the fitness certification himself. Harwick had been returned to his unit with a document that said he was fit for limited duty, and which, he later understood, had used a form designation that did not exist in standard procedure. The 61 days had been the longest recovery period of his service to that point, and during them he had become familiar with Trent, the way a patient became familiar with a treating physician through repeated contact, not as a person he knew in any way that mattered, but as a professional presence with specific habits and a specific manner of conducting assessment. Trent was efficient. Trent did not speak more than the procedure required. Trent filed his paperwork immediately on completion of each interaction rather than at the end of a shift, which was a disciplined approach that Harwick had noted as a marker of a man who did not allow work to accumulate. He had not formed a view of Trent beyond these functional observations. He had not thought about Trent's motives or calculations. He had recovered, been certified, returned to his unit and continued. He did not know at that time about the form designation. Wounds 16 and 17 he covered without extended description. Wound 16, a burn to the lower right leg from an incendiary device delivered short of its intended target because of a grid coordinate error in the Vox chain. The grid coordinate error had been introduced at some point in a 3-relay communication chain and had been confirmed incorrect only after the device was deployed, and the unit had spent 40 minutes trying to understand why the strike pattern did not correspond to the briefed position. By then Wound 16 had already happened. Significant burn, treated in facility, standard recovery. He had kept the foam applicator tube in his kit afterward, the same way he had kept the gauze from Wound 7, because it was a useful item and it was in his hand at the wrong moment. Wound 17, a ferrocrete strike to the back of his skull, 45 minutes unconscious, 3 days limited duty, tinnitus in the left ear that had never resolved. He could not say with certainty whether Wound 17 had caused the tinnitus, or whether the tinnitus had existed before and simply become the dominant frequency afterward. Wound 18, a fragment wound to the right shoulder, documented correctly. Between Wound 18 and Wound 19, Harwick said, "I was in a recovery facility for approximately 3 months." Carpenter had his pen ready. He paused. "The Amber Ward," Harwick said. "I believe it was on Cadian soil, or Acadian-affiliated administrative world. A secondary Medici facility. The ward physician was a man called Cole. I believe that was a first name used in formal. The walls were a specific amber-yellow color, not institutional white or gray. A deliberate choice, the color of old resin, of certain industrial sealants applied to surfaces in humid environment. That specific amber yellow. There was a window in the ward that looked out over a transit hub. Cargo lifters moving between loading platforms at regular intervals. I was there for 3 months under full rest classification. No duty, complete rest." Carpenter was looking at a secondary document he had placed beneath the primary form. "Your service record," Carpenter said, "shows continuous active duty classification between Wound 18 and Wound 19. No facility transfer, no rest period. The records may be incomplete," Harwick said. "They may be," Carpenter said carefully. "I'll note the discrepancy." He said this the way he said everything, with precision, without color. But his pen paused above the form a moment before touching it, which was a thing Harwick noted. The amber yellow was specific. He was not uncertain about it. Dreams had a vague, shifting quality even in the moments of their apparent clarity. He had been in enough situations that produced dream-adjacent states to know the difference. The amber ward's walls were concrete in his memory, in a way that dream details never were. The color of old resin, of industrial sealant, of something functional that had been given a quality that was almost warmth without quite being warmth. Coal he was less certain about. The name might belong somewhere else, attached to a different person in a different context, but the color and the window and the cargo lifters and the specific quality of the rest, the actual sensation of being without duty weight, a lightness he had not felt before or experienced since, these were not manufactured. He did not say any of this to Carpenter. He said, "Wound 19, the ear, a pressure wave from an artillery strike on the parapet lip, 2 meters from his position. No penetrating wound, no surgically addressable damage, but the interior mechanism of the left ear had been restructured by the concussive force in a way that had not resolved. Approximately 60% hearing loss on that side, classified by Surgeon Major Trent 8 months later in a wound annotation as likely temporary. It had been 4 years. Trent certified wound 19, Carpenter asked. Yes, Harwick said. He certified most of them from 15 on. I believe all of them. Carpenter's pen was still. He was looking at the form in the way of a man who has found something that requires a different approach. Is there something to note? Harwick asked. I'll note it, Carpenter said. Wounds 20 and 21, he described without pause, in a flat accounting voice that was the correct voice for those events. Wound 20 was a bayonet wound to the upper left thigh, sustained in a hand-to-hand engagement in a hive undercroft, where the confined geometry had made directed energy fire impractical, and the action had devolved into contact weapons, and whatever came readily to hand in a dark space with insufficient room for deliberate aim. He had been in 3 of those engagements across his service. He regarded them as the worst category, not because of the danger level, which was comparable to other categories, but because of the specific quality of decision-making they required, and the specific quality of memory they produced. Wound 21 was the shoulder. A building collapsed during a city-clearing operation, a beam catching the back of his left shoulder between itself and the ground. The musculature was damaged comprehensively enough that his left shoulder rotation was permanently reduced to approximately 80% of its original range. His firing arm was his right. The limitation had no impact on his duty classification. During the description of the fitness certification for 21, he mentioned, as context for the timeline, Trent had used a form designator he had not recognized when completing the certifications from Wound 15 onward, something like Medicae 119B AGI, or a variant notation. He had assumed it was a supplementary designation for soldiers with complex multi-incident histories. He offered this without emphasis. It was information adjacent to the events he was describing. Carpenter set his pen on the writing board. What was the exact designator? Carpenter said. I can't give the exact designator. I saw it on the forms when Trent was completing them. Wounds 18 and 21 specific. I watched him write the header, a variant of 119B with an additional suffix. I assumed it was standard. Was it not? I'll follow up on that, Carpenter said. He made a note in the margin and underlined it twice. Wound 22. He began to describe it and encountered the gap. He knew an incident had occurred involving a Medicae orderly because he had been told this afterward, and because the documentation of that incident was apparently part of why Carpenter was here. He did not have a memory of the incident. He had the events preceding it. The cause of Wound 22, which was a lasbolt to the right shoulder during a convoy engagement, the burn significant, the shoulder joint involved, transport to this facility, initial assessment, the stim dose administered before formal processing, because field practice on that evacuation route prioritized pain management ahead of documentation. And then he was in a different part of the facility, a different area, not the intake bay. His right hand, the wounded side, the side that should have been immobilized, had dried blood on the knuckles. His shoulder was in a later stage of treatment than it had been. There was an orderly not present who had been present before. He did not have fragments of what was inside the gap. He had before and he had after, and between them was simply absence, complete and unstructured, not the absence of a gap in a record, which is a gap you can see, but the absence of a flaw between two walls, where the walls exist and the gap between them exists, but there is no information about what was there or what removed it. He told Carpenter this precisely. He did not embellish the absence or interpret it. It was an absence. That was the accurate description, Carpenter said. The incident report states the orderly sustained a laceration and 2 fractured metacarpal bones. I don't have a memory of that. The report indicates you were still under combat stim dose, a higher than standard dose, administered before intake assessment. Yes, that is consistent with the evacuation protocol on that route. He looked at the right hand. The right hand had the old topology from Wound 7's work on the opposite hand. No, that was the left hand. He was confusing them, which happened occasionally. The 2 hands had been worked on enough that their individual histories blurred at the edges. The right hand had the burn from Wound 18, the fragment scar, the general roughness of extended use. If the report was accurate, it had also done something during the gap that he had no access to from inside his own experience. This was a strange thing to accept. He accepted it. Strange things had a way of being the most accurate description. He mentioned, as an afterthought, that the standard Form Medicae 119B fitness certifications had been filed by whoever was assigned to his unit's medical office before Wound 15, and that from Wound 15 onward Trent had changed the designator. He said this without calculation. Carpenter underlined his previous margin note twice more. Wound 23 was the current one. He described it without more time than it required. A shrapnel fragment to the left side during the convoy engagement that had also produced the circumstances of Wound 22's aftermath. Same engagement, 9 days between the 2 wound events because of treatment protocols. Fragment to the chest wall, field management, transport, drainage installation, drainage removal this morning. You've described that procedure, Carpenter said. Yes, Harwick said. Carpenter finished writing. He reorganized his papers in a way that Harwick had been watching all morning, but had not correctly categorized until now. Not random organization, a sequencing. The form he had been filling all morning moved to the bottom of the stack. A different form moved to the top. Corporal Harwick, Carpenter said, I need to clarify my role. Harwick waited. I'm not attached to this Medicae facility. I'm an administrative assessor from the 9th Helical Subsector Munitorum Review Board. Outside the curtain partition, in the ward proper, an equipment trolley was being moved. The specific squeal of one wheel not turning freely, a periodic complaint, moving down the ward and then stopping. The wet-breathing patient had gone quiet. Harwick noted this and assigned it no significance, because assigning significance in advance produced inaccurate assessment. This documentation, Carpenter said, is not a wound intake assessment. It is a service disposition review. From across the bay, past 2 curtain partitions, a voice said clearly, and without any connection to what was currently happening. Road north of the river doesn't have the right substrate for that weight of vehicle. Nobody responded. The voice said nothing further. Harwick said, What is a service disposition review? Carpenter explained. He had done this before. The explanation was structured, moving through its components without hesitation. A service disposition review was triggered when a combination of factors made standard regimental reintegration impossible or inadvisable. Harwick's review had been triggered by 2 factors. Factor 1. Surgeon Major Trent had been removed from his post 4 weeks ago following an audit of his fitness certification records, specifically his use of a variant form designation, Medicae 119B AGI, which was not a supplementary designation for complex wound histories and was not a form designation that existed anywhere in standard Munitorum certification procedure. It was a variant form Trent had constructed and used to certify soldiers as fit for limited duty when their wound severity index exceeded the standard invalidity threshold. 7 soldiers had been certified through this variant. 6 had sustained subsequent wound events. 4 of those 6 were dead. The other 2 were currently in Medicae facilities in this subsect. Harwick was one of them. Factor 2. The incident during Wound 22's treatment had produced a disciplinary record, combined with the investigation of Trent's certifications and the formal review of Harwick's service record specifically, which had been flagged as one of the most extensive variant certification records in Trent's file. Reintegration into his regiment was inadvisable until the investigation reached a conclusion. The investigation had no specified timeline. The available resolution was a transfer to the 934th Penitent Cohort, a penal legion formation being assembled for deployment in the outer helical subsector. Harwick listened to each element as it arrived. He processed each one and moved to the next. He noticed the absence of whatever he expected to feel and examined it, and found it was not absence of feeling as suppression, which he knew from Wound 15's aftermath from other specific points, but a simpler kind. The absence that was what you had left when you had been using something a long time and the thing had been adequate, but had not accumulated to a reserve. He was not angry. He was not surprised. He was present, processing, current. These were all the things he needed to be. Regarding the amber ward, Carpenter said, the way he said it, with that specific careful manner, was the manner of a man who had looked something up and found what he had expected to find, and was now required to deliver it accurately. There was an amber ward, Carpenter said, a secondary Medici recovery facility, operating on Acadian-affiliated world in this subsector, active for approximately 12 years. Decommissioned and demolished 11 years ago, 3 years before your 18th wound incident. There is no facility matching your description that was operational during the period you've described. The fan above the door made its catch on the 4th rotation. Harwick lay still, the amber-yellow walls. He held them in his mind without pressing on them. He had 2 options, and neither changed the outcome.